right? Everyone is reeling from the shooting that happened in Uvalde, Texas, I think it's called, the school, right? Almost 20, I think 20 people, is it 20 people, like 19 children, a teacher killed in a mass shooting. This is just 10 days after the white supremacists who killed, what was it? 7, 8 people and injured overall, I think something like 10, right? Like in a black community at Tops in Buffalo, New York. I mean, what we were talking today is very relevant, right? Finance capitalism, the race to the bottom, what we're talking about, the results of that, the conditions that that brings, definitely fuels. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that a lot of these mass shootings have occurred in the last 40, 50 years, where finance capital has usurped much of the capitalist economy, is the hegemonic force, and has created conditions of just utter misery, a great race to the bottom. And that's what we're seeing, I think. I think we're seeing what the result of that is. Now, mass shootings themselves are not necessarily just out of economic rebellion. I don't believe that. I don't believe the white supremacists, that was what it was about. I don't believe that as the motive force, though. However, if you look at the ground level, the kind of chaos, the social dislocation, the alienation, and the normalization of violence, because as we were talking about, finance capitalism, neoliberal capitalism requires endless war. And so this normalization of violence, this normalization of white supremacy in a broad spectrum, right? This militarization of the world. Everyone talks about the gun lobby, but no one's talking about the military industrial complex, but they're totally related, intimately related. You can't have one without the other, right? The military industrial complex would not exist and the gun lobby would not exist without each other, because really what it's all about is about profiteering from an environment of total warfare. And so that is turning inward. There is chickens coming home to roost, as Malcolm X would say. And so these tragedies are mounting, they keep happening. And unfortunately, what we have politically, because neoliberal finance capital dominates politics, what you have is these politicians playing cynical games, right? Propagandistic games, games meant to distract you from the real legitimate problem. The problem isn't just that um, it isn't just that these events happen. It's that these politicians create an environment where the narrative around it is inherently obfuscatory. It inherently obfuscates the reality and the roots of the problem. And so we get into conversations about gun control versus no gun control, rather than looking at what is it about this society that's so sick that this can happen? And what is the role of the state in all of this, right? How does a violent militarist society with a deep state and intelligence apparatus, trillions worth of dollars being spent on war, subversion, and all kinds of violence, prisons, policing, all of it, trillions going into that. What does it say? What does that say about the society and how it develops people who end up doing things like this? Normalization of violence, normalization of a completely and utterly socially alienated society to go on par with and in parallel with the economic alienation of capitalism. Because insofar as we can't say that, okay, paying gender on head, I think this is a unfortunate talking point even on the right wing. It's like, oh well, it's all about class, right? And the liberals do it too, and even the social democrats say, well, if everyone just had Medicare for all, we wouldn't have mass shootings, white supremacist shootings. That's not necessarily true, right? White supremacy exists in Europe. White supremacy exists in the places where there are social, these benefits, and those countries participate in wars and violence all the same. However, the social solidarity piece, I think, is much more interesting in the sense that when you have no accountability to your communities and to others, and you have a militarized culture, and you have an economic base that is fracturing, that is leading to a great race to the bottom, where finance capital steals everything, then I think you have this perfect toxic soup for mass shootings to occur and for these tragedies to occur. I think you have to look at all of these factors, look at all of them, because I don't think you can have one without the other, right? And to find simple explanations for something that is complex, I think is inherently disingenuous and leads us to very narrow conversations like the ones that are being had by whatever Chris Murphy, right? The what, I don't, what is he? He's a Connecticut representative, or is he the governor of? I don't even know. Right? We had. I think it's the. I think he's the. He's a senator, right? He's the senator of Connecticut. Is that who it is? Um, yes. So yeah. So he was going viral, and you have Joe Biden going off on Twitter saying, "Oh yeah, we are going to do something about guns, right? We have to do something. Why aren't we doing something?" And it's like, what? Literally, you just were sending 40 billion in military weapons aid, money for weapons, most of which is going to military contractors to Ukraine to enact and wage violence, and you're lecturing about doing something when you're the president of the United States and you could executive order some kind of gun control legislation if you wanted. But then again, would that kind of regulation really make the difference, right? Because I think what ends up happening in this neoliberal period is once the cat is out of the bag, once the forces are unleashed, right? We were talking about it in the stream, right? Once the ball is rolling down the hill, how do you get it rolling back up the hill? Something, we have to think about social transformation, right? And more so revolutionary terms than these reformist terms, because a problem like mass shootings, right? The people who are willing to do this, even if there was regulations, people are going to find their way into the ways into these guns, especially if you can't get rid of, right? And this is social transformation. You have to get rid of the gun lobbies and the big manufacturers. You can't allow them to exist if you're going to curb the gun violence. And that's not even to speak to what is happening in society that is leading people to take these actions. But even just at the level of how do you take the lethal means out of people's hands? Well, you got to get rid of the gun manufacturers. And do we really think that that's going to happen? And then, of course, there's this bigger question that people always have. They always want to bring it up, even though we're not even in any kind of position to talk about this. And it makes me a little angry that people always bring this up: is right to bear arms. We should be able to defend ourselves from a tyrannical government. What are you talking about? You're not arming yourself for self-defense. I am 100% in support of any oppressed people that is defending themselves from state violence through arms, right? I've supported all of the revolutions which required this and which continue to require it, that exist and have existed in the world against capitalism, right? Of course, that's not what we should, but we're not even, if that's a stage we need to get to, which we will have to continue to debate. I mean, I believe that this violent society, this militarized imperialist order won't go without violence, right? That they're going to use, they're using violence already against us. They're going to continue to. But the conversation, I don't think, is about whether we need to protect our right to bear arms. That's the for through the colonial kind of constitutional amendment. I think the question is, what is causing this? Who is behind? What is behind it? Who are these people who are behind it? How does this happen? And we never get any good analysis from this, because what usually happens with Peyton Gendron, seized by the feds, you ain't gonna ever see him again. There's gonna be no investigation. That's gonna be some kind of strange kangaroo court where he's made a political example and or the opposite. It happened with Dylan Roof. Never hear from them again. He was made an example because Black Lives Matter and all that would have, burned the streets down if Dylan Roof got off. So he's in prison, but you don't hear from them. You don't get any investigation. You don't, but I think we can understand through history why someone like Dylan Roof would do what he did. Same with Peyton Gendron. Now, with someone like what happened with this school, right? Like, this is, of course, we can't say it's racially motivated or anything like that. It's being painted as this like random act of violence, even though we've had dozens upon dozens of them over the last several years alone. Well, how does this happen? right? People have access to guns, yes. Surely people have mental health disorders, but I'm a therapist, I'm a social worker. I ain't gonna blame mental health disorders on mass shootings. I think that's egregious. I think that's stigmatizing. I think that's problematic. I don't think it has a place in our discourse as a movement because it's spurious. It doesn't necessarily correlate because there are so many people who don't do any act of violence despite even the most extreme serious mental health disorders uh, don't always lead to violence. Can, but don't always. But then again, we still should ask the question: what causes this? What causes it, right? And how do we find that out? Well, we can't find it out through a state that has no interest in finding it out. They don't want the government. It's obvious. The state doesn't want us to. They have their political motivations and orientation, and they don't want us to find out, right? That we have to then speculate, analyze for ourselves, do that kind of homework for ourselves. But there are no easy explanations. For me, it's the chickens are here to roost. The society is crumbling. The empire is crumbling. It has been for the last 40, 50 years. And so these incidences have skyrocketed since then. And then you factor in with when you have these conditions of decay, then you factor in the profiteering out of it through these weapons manufacturers. And then you can kind of get a sense of, yes, there is a toxic soup in the United States brewing, and it's leading to these acts of violence, which cause so much devastation and give us all of this pause for concern in a moment where we need more class struggle. We can't be debilitated, right, and traumatized, but that's what these acts are meant to do, right? All violence in this way, cross-class violence, interclass violence, all of it, violence among the general population, when it doesn't have a class basis to it, right? When there isn't a class struggle basis to the violence, it is meant to traumatize and actually harm the class struggle. And that's what, of course, that's what white supremacist violence is all about. That has a class basis to it. Usually it's targeting those people that have been identified as enemies, as whatever, all of the different names, right? Is basically enemies of quote unquote civilization, and they're targeted for violence. But when it is just gun violence among the population, and there is no indication of the quote unquote race factor, when there is sort of with Sandy Hook and those kind of things, you have to look deeper. Then you have to look at the roots of what's happening. And oftentimes, still, these factors like racism and white supremacy, economics like capitalist alienation, like the social isolation, like all of these various outgrowths of an empire in decline, they often play a role. And so there are no easy solutions. We can't just say, oh, yeah, take away the guns. People find a way to get things, even when you regulate something like that. So I think that we need to look deeper, and we have to understand how fraudulent it is that these so-called government officials are even talking about it like this, because how many times have we heard it? There isn't any public action. They're not actually going to respond to this through policy that will help people, right? There's not going to be any serious regulation of the weapons manufacturers. What kind of precedent would that set? It would set a precedent that they can't allow to happen at the moment, because most of these politicians are bought and paid for by these very same corporations. And then when you talk about the gun manufacturers here, if you start regulating that, then you're talking about what happens to the government, which purchases a lot of these military weapons from the Pentagon, which are produced by these private manufacturers themselves. What do you do about that? Right? So there's these can of worms, right? These can of worms that you can't open in a system that is predicated upon this violence. And so we have to continue to have real discussions about what this all means.